Ending child abuse. To start my presentation on child abuse, first I would like to go over the history of this crime. Up until the late 1800s, all children were considered to be property of their parents, as American colonists granted child abuse as normal. This goes to show that child abuse has been in the US since the beginning of time, making it normal in the 16th and 17th centuries. The first famous case of child abuse came to light in the early 1870s when an orphan named Mary Ellen Wilson, who's pictured, was being beaten by her foster parents. Because of her community, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was notified because there was no prevention of child abuse at the time. The foster mother was eventually convicted, and because of how much light was shed on this case, citizens put together the first child abuse prevention organization in 1874 called the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. In 1962, society became aware of child abuse again because of an article that was written defining and giving examples of child abuse. 10 years later, every state agreed on the mandatory reporting law, which meant any professional who worked with children and saw signs of abuse must report it. This law is still effective today. In 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act took action in helping to prevent child abuse. They gave money to fund for different programs, shelters, and services for abused children and to help the personal growth of victims. According to the U.S. government, child abuse comes in 4 forms: physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse, all of which are a huge problem in the United States. According to Child Help, an online prevention center, states children are suffering from a hidden epidemic of abuse and neglect. It's a widespread war against our children that we have the power to stop, and understanding the issue is the first step. To say it's an epidemic is an understatement. I think child abuse is a huge pandemic, as it happens all over the world in different forms. Because of the lack of community support in reporting abuse, children are secretly suffering with what seems to be no way out for them. With that being said, there are 5 human rights articles that are being violated when a child is abused. The first one is Article 1: all humans are born free and equal. When a child is born, they could be born into an abusive home and be abused from the beginning of their life, making a child not born free. Article 3, the right to life, is also being violated, as this article stands for the right to live in freedom and safety, which is being broken if a child is abused in their own home. Article 4, which is no one should be held in slavery, is being broken because these children are being held against their will and abused, which is similar to how slaves lived a long time ago. Lastly, Article 30, human rights cannot be taken away, is sadly being violated by these children's trusted adults. The demographics about child abuse are frightening. Here are some demographics and facts about children in the US. About 5 children die every day because of child abuse. Over 70% of abused children who die are younger than the age of 3. 2.9 million cases are reported every year. This only counts those reported, as most go unreported, so the accurate number is much higher. Abused children have higher percentages of ending up in jail. 59% are more likely to be arrested as a minor, 28% are more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% are more likely to commit a violent crime. 80% of abused children grow up to have at least one psychological disorder. And lastly, 14% of men and 36% of women in prisons were victims of child abuse. The 3 images at the bottom are more demographics about child abuse. There have been many programs, strategies, and policies made to try to stop child abuse. Seen on the slide are just a few programs part of helping the victims. The Children's Justice Act is an act made to provide funds for the improvement of investigation and prosecution of those abusing children. They also teach members the correct way to approach situations when child abuse is suspected to be at play. This group focuses on all types of child abuse, but specifically sexual abuse. As said in their logo, Child Help is an organization dedicated to the prevention and treatment of child abuse. Stated by their website, their goal is to meet the physical, emotional, educational, and spiritual need of abused, neglected, and at-risk children through several different programs run by Compassion, Kindness, and Love. The National Conferences on Child Abuse and Neglect is an annual conference which helps to educate the community about child abuse, as well as learning about the current efforts the group has in place to be part of the prevention. Despite their efforts, child abuse is still a worldwide problem. These programs are unsuccessful in preventing child abuse because of the lack of reports in the community. Child abuse can only be acknowledged if someone reports it, and not enough people know the signs or if a child is really being abused enough to report it to someone. People are often scared of ruining someone's life or sending them into the foster care system. People may say it's not any of their business, they don't know the extent of the abuse, or just don't want to get involved. But because of those reasons, children are secretly suffering. Two successful programs are the ACT, or Parents Raising Safe Kids, and the Triple P program. The ACT, Parents Raising Safe Kids, educates parents and those who work with kids on how to protect children from child abuse. Although this doesn't put a stop to child abuse, their main goal is to help have better parents and professionals who can easily spot signs of abuse and report it. The Triple P, which stands for Positive Parenting Program, is successful in terms of meeting their goal, which is to provide a place where families can be part of different programs until their children reach 16. They also help treat children for their behavioral and emotional problems. Again, success relies on reports so that officials can do something about abuse. Abuse is also historically proven that it starts at childhood. It's proven that 30 to 40% of parents who abuse their children were also abused as a child themselves. People who were abused as children are also 51% more likely to be in a domestic violence relationship, meaning their whole life is full of abuse. A new policy I think should be implemented are having psychologists in schools. The already implemented school psychologists are meant to help the needs of learning, behavior, and mental health for students. Although I would implement a different kind of psychologist. I would implement a psychologist who is specifically there to detect abuse and mental health issues. Every school must have this kind of psychologist and must meet with every student in the school every week. Based on age, the psychologist will use a method to figure out how they're mentally doing in their home life. For example, for younger students, they could use some kind of drawing technique, while for older students, they could use a hypnotizing technique or even just talk it out. This way, they could figure out if a child is being abused or not. This would have to be implemented as a policy for every school so that they wouldn't need parent signatures. It would be a requirement for every school to have, no matter if it's public, private, Catholic, or any other type of school. For children who seem to be doing fine and not abused, this meeting can just serve as talking about anything in their life, like academics, sports, etc. This would be different than a regular school psychologist that some schools have because these psychologists must have a specialty in child abuse and be used specifically for that, unless a child is not being abused. This policy/strategy would be implemented in every elementary, middle, and high school. There could be more than one psychologist so that all students are able to get the time they need. One psychologist can be assigned to the youngest students, the other can be assigned to the middle-aged students, while another is assigned to the older students. This program would also be linked to CPS in case an emergency were to happen. If signs of child abuse are constant between two meetings, a home visit should be required and the family should be monitored. Psychologists would be able to report the family to CPS whenever they seem fit. If the psychologist noticed that a student has been missing from class for a few days, calls should be made home and the student must be required to talk. The resources that would be needed are funding, a private office, and time. Schools would need to pay psychologists, and if a school is low income, then the government should give funds so that the psychologist can be paid and be able to buy any necessary resources themselves, such as games. The psychologists must have their own office for privacy reasons. Time would be the most important resource they need. Every student would have to have a 1-hour meeting time each week, and in order to stay organized, the meeting time would most likely be the same every week, although this depends on what the psychologist would want. This would mean that teachers would have to be flexible with their schedules and understand if a student's scheduled time is during a test, then they still need to be at their meeting. Since the psychologist's job is to detect mental health issues and specifically abuse in the home, teachers and students would need to understand the importance of these meeting times. Although exceptions would be made if, for example, a student had not shown any signs of abuse or mental health issues within the last few months and had a test at their designated meeting time, then it would be okay for the psychologist to sign off on them being at their test. They wouldn't need too many resources except the tools they plan to use to help communicate with the students. The main goal of having a required psychologist for abuse and mental health is to detect and find any signs of abuse or mental health issues right away. Although I did mention that psychologists would also be implemented in high schools, it is a goal that if abuse or mental health issues were happening, that it would be found before high school. Essentially, keeping children safe as they grow up is the job of the psychologist. If abuse is found, the psychologist could essentially save the child's life. It is also to stop any further abuse or trauma that the child can go through. Hopefully, if abuse is found early, then the child wouldn't go on to be part of the statistic of being in a relationship with domestic violence or going on to abusing their own children. Although trauma will always be there, it is important that the psychologist save them as soon as possible. Another goal is to arrest the parents who are found to be abusing their children so that they can never hurt another child again. They would need to pay for their actions, which could be done in prison. This solves the problem of child abuse because abuse would be found and stopped as early as possible. It also helps to protect those human rights which are broken when a child is abused. Articles 1, 3, 4, 5, and 30 would no longer be violated and would be finally protected for that child. It would also reduce the risk of any further child abuse happening. If caught early, the child could potentially recover from the abuse, which could save many people that the child could have grown up to abuse themselves. As with anything, there will always be limitations and critiques. I think one limitation would be that once a child hits a certain age, they would move on to a psychologist for older students. Since a student might feel a connection with a certain psychologist and trust them, they may not want to tell details of their life to a different person. Abusive parents may also find out about these meetings before the child reports abuse, and this could result in backlash. This could cause the parent to abuse the child more as well as go after the school. Psychologists could also mistakenly think that a child is being abused and call CPS. This would cause the innocent family to go through a lot of work to prove that their child isn't being abused. This would cause a lot of hassle for the family and again could result in backlash for the school. Effects could be both good and bad. The good effects would include getting a child out of an abusive and dangerous home life, as well as potentially turning their life around for the better. You would also be reducing the chance of any further abuse happening throughout their life. The child could also be adopted by a loving family and grow up with everything they've wanted and needed, which they didn't get before. Trauma will most likely happen whether the child is saved from the abuse early on or later on in life. If saved, the child could potentially go into the foster system if they had nowhere else to go. From there, both good and bad could happen. Hopefully, the child would be adopted by a loving family who would work to treat the trauma the child has been through. Unfortunately, this isn't always the case. There is so much abuse going on in the foster system that nobody really tries to find it fixed. An abused child could end up in an abusive foster home, which could only further their trauma. Other than that, siblings could also be separated in the foster system and never see each other again. Sadly, an abused child's life is really in the hands of who adopts them, when they're adopted, and those people's intentions. The child would also need to go to therapy, which would have to be paid for by somebody. This also depends on who adopts them and if they are able to put the child through therapy. It would be great if good people were able to adopt children so that those abused children could finally have a happy ending. But sadly, this isn't always the case, which is a huge problem in the foster care and adoption system. Some questions to think about include, if this policy were to be implemented, what is a way that we could protect children during the summers? How about during shelter at home? Do you think this would significantly change the number of children being abused? And why do you think this hasn't been implemented yet? And these are my resources. Thank you.